Welcome to the Sheroes of Beijing Stories, the podcast series, brought to you by UN Women Nigeria and Women in Successful Careers, WISCAR. In this series, we would be sharing and celebrating stories of women's activism in Nigeria. The women in this podcast were present in the Fourth World Conference on Women, popularly tagged Beijing 1995, and their extensive and impactful experience and commitment to the empowerment of women is why we continue to celebrate them. At WISCAR, we believe in the power of a shared story in leading the next generation to aspire, grow, and contribute to nation building. We hope you will be inspired as you listen. Welcome. In this episode, Amina Oyagbola, founder and chairperson of WISCAR, will be in conversation with Her Excellency Bisi Adeleye-Fayemi. Bisi Adeleye-Fayemi is a feminist activist, gender and development specialist, social entrepreneur, policy advocate, trainer, and writer. She served as the director of Akina Mamawa Africa, AMWA, an international development organization for African women based in London. She established the African Women's Leadership Institute, AWLI, a training and networking forum for young African women. She is also the co-founder and first CEO of the African Women's Development Fund, the first grant-making foundation for women's organizations based in Ghana. She is currently the CEO of Above Whispers Media Group and manages several women development initiatives, including AboveWhispers.com and the Rapper Network. She has served as a UN Women Nigeria Senior Advisor and is currently a visiting Senior Research Fellow at the Africa Leadership Centre, King's College, London. As First Lady of Ekiti State, she was instrumental to passing bills for women like the Gender-Based Violence Prohibition Law, revised in October 2019, and the Equal Opportunities Bill 2013. Here you have it. Welcome, Your Excellency, to this platform. What a privilege it is to have you here today in conversation with me. We are delighted to have an author, a gender activist, and a very strong voice in the advocacy for human rights with us today. A woman of substance and a woman of many, many parts. Welcome, Erelu Bisi Adeleye-Fayemi, and thank you for all that you do in the fight for gender equality and for women. So let's get started on our conversation.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure and very well deserved.
It's great to be here.
Thank you. You are indeed a seasoned advocate for women's rights and empowerment, and your life's work has been about pursuing this cause passionately and relentlessly. Prior to Beijing, you had attended many other UN Women conferences. What was unique, madam, about the Beijing conference? And how did attending the Beijing conference shape or influence your advocacy and your contribution to the gender agenda?
Thank you very much. And the Beijing conference took place in 1995. And prior to that time, the United Nations had organized a series of conferences around some key issues. There was the 1992 conference on the environment in Rio, the 1993 conference on human rights in Vienna, the population conference in Cairo, and the International Development Conference in Copenhagen in March 1995. So at all those conferences, women's rights activists from around the world tried to get their issues onto their agenda, tried to get policymakers and governments around the world to look at those issues from the point of view of women, particularly women from the Global South. So by the time the United Nations got round to organizing the Beijing conference in 1995, women around the world were mobilized, they were sensitized, and they were ready to claim that conference as the space where it was not going to be a matter of adding their issues onto something else. It would be their space to articulate their issues from all around the world. And as a result, the Beijing conference saw the largest gathering ever at any United Nations conference. 40,000 women and a handful of men, but mostly women, descended on Beijing for the Beijing conference. Amazing. The United Nations had never witnessed that kind of gathering before. And another thing that made Beijing unique, apart from the fact that women claimed it as their own space after having tried to infiltrate other spaces prior to that time, was the fact that women from grassroots communities around the world not only mobilized in their different countries, but a lot of them managed to get to Beijing.
Oh, I see.
I came across a group of women, for example, who attended the Beijing conference of Nigeria. They had been mobilized to attend by the late Chief Bisi Adeleye-Fayemi, the founder of Country Women's Association of Nigeria, COAN. So I ran into one of these women who happened to be from Ondo State, my state, and I asked her, "Auntie, how are you going back? What airline did you come with? What airline are you going back?" She said, "Airways." I said, "Which one?" She said, "I don't know more. I don't know." As far as she was concerned, she went to Beijing on an airplane, and she was going to go back on an airplane.
Amazing.
And I found that absolutely fascinating.
Yes, they were determined.
Because if those women didn't get to take part in the debate, they were there. They went there to sell goods, to trade, to interact. So it was really unique in terms of women being able to place their own issues on global agendas and take that back locally. In terms of how it affected my own advocacy afterwards, I think in the run-up to the Beijing conference, I was thinking about what it should mean for my generation going forward. And I was having conversations, of course, with my peers at the time. So after the Beijing conference, I was involved in the founding of the African Women's Leadership Institute, which was a program of Akinamama Africa that I was working with at the time. And we decided to set up this Leadership Institute as a space for young African women to prepare them for a time when they would be responsible for implementing the provisions of the Beijing Platform for Action. We wanted to be prepared. We wanted young African women between the ages of 25 to 40 to have the competence, the networks, and the exposure.
Wonderful.
And since the Leadership Institute started in 1996, we have trained over 8,000 African women from all over the continent, and many of them are now in key decision-making positions.
Fantastic.
The current vice president of the Gambia, for example, passed through the African Women's Leadership Institute.
Wow.
And another initiative that came out of that, of course, that you're familiar with, is the African Women's Development Fund.
Yes.
Because when I left Akinamama, I went to co-found the African Women's Development Fund so that we could mobilize resources for the African women's movement, because access to funding kept being a recurring issue.
I wanted to interrupt you, before you go on about the African Women's Development Fund, and just acknowledge and appreciate you and your organization for, the support that, the African Women Development Fund has given to my organization, WISCAR. Please do carry on.
Thank you very much, Auntie Amina. And so my work with all those spaces continues to influence what I do today. When my husband became governor of Ekiti State and I became the first lady, people who were aware of the work I'd done before had certain expectations of me that I'll bring some of that back home. Of course, charity begins at home.
Absolutely.
So if I have been involved in helping to nurture women's organizations, movements in other spaces, the least I can do is, do the same thing for my own people. And that is why today Ekiti State has a really great enabling environment for gender equality and women's empowerment. And we have some of the most robust policy frameworks and laws in the country that support the empowerment of women. So the legacy of Beijing continues.
Oh, you're doing amazing work. I mean, you really are, leading, and you are a role model for so many other women across the country. So thank you so much, for what you do.
in the book, The Sheroes of Beijing, which is about to go to market, which you, of course, contributed to with other amazing Nigerian Sheroes, Nigerian women, we touch on the role of women's movements and organizations in advancing the gender agenda. Can you kindly share, to the listeners, what an effective women's movement looks like or should look like? And also, with your experience, what, in your own opinion, are the key enablers and success factors in building strong women's movements? And, one final, point is really, how can we in Nigeria re-energize and reignite, women's movements? I mean, what you described, that happened in Beijing 25 years ago, how can we ensure that same, energy, is put back into, women's movements in Nigeria to accelerate progress and national development?
Well, I think what we need to have a strong and effective women's movement are a number of things, and they are all interrelated and interconnected. We, first of all, need women who are committed, who are determined, who are consistent, and who are focused. And it sounds simple to say things like that, but we know how people get, set or tired when there is a setback. And then they say, after putting in all this energy, or because I've, run into a couple of people who don't agree with me, I'm not engaged in this anymore. Social change takes time.
Yes.
And so leaders in social change movements have to stay focused and committed. And we have seen women like that in our movement here in Nigeria. A number of them have passed away, and I think we know all those who are key actors now. It's important to also pay tribute to those who have, in their own way, made this work possible. Starting from the likes of the late Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti, the late Margaret Ekpo, Gambo Sawaba, down to another generation, the late Professor Jade Sola Akonde, Professor Felicia Ekejuiba, Chief Bisi Ogunleye, more recently, the sisters we lost, like Chief Bisi, Olateru, Olagbegi, Obin Wankwo. There are so many of them, and of course those who are still alive, Amina Mama, Aisha Imam, Benema Junagu, and so on. We have had women like that, and we'll continue to have women like that who we can look up to and learn from. Each generation is going to be faced with that challenge of having a group of women who are prepared to provide leadership. And that leadership, in my view, is across generations. Whatever age you are, whatever position you are in, you are entitled to a space within the feminist movement. Another thing that is important for movements to thrive and grow is consensus around what exactly it is you want to be addressing. A lot of times, patriarchy or, men push back and say women don't know what they want. Even amongst themselves, they can't agree. But that's not true. Women know what they want. And if you look at the trends over the years in terms of what Nigerian women in particular have coalesced around, the African women's movement in general has agreed on those issues. But to speak about Nigeria specifically, we have coalesced around a certain number of issues that we regard as a priority. So, for example, I don't think any women's rights activists in the country would say that peace and security is not an issue for Nigerian women. That's an absolute priority. Without peace, there can be no development.
Absolutely.
And we will not be safe.
Yes.
The second issue we have consensus on is the issue of women's economic empowerment and livelihoods. Women will continue to be vulnerable if they don't have a source of livelihood, if they don't have access to education, training, capital, all the tools that they need to empower themselves. So that's another area that women have mobilized around over the years. A third area is the issue of personal security, mitigating sexual and gender-based violence. In recent times, we are seeing more traction on this issue, but we have been fighting to draw attention to this issue for a long time. Women and girls are preyed on right from the beginning of their life cycle to the end. 2-month-old babies are vulnerable. 90-year-old women are vulnerable. So there is consensus in the women's movement that we need to do what we can to mitigate sexual and gender-based violence. Then there is the issue of women's health and reproductive rights. Nigeria has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world. Actually, maternal and infant mortality rates. In this day and age, women should not be dying simply because they want to bring life into the world. So we are very concerned about this, and we continue to mobilize around the issue of women's health, women's maternal health, women's reproductive rights, and what we all need to do to ensure that women can live their lives as productively as possible. And then one other area that we all have consensus on is women's access to decision-making positions.
And leadership.
We cannot continue to have a society and leadership, yes, women's access to leadership, in all spheres of public life. We cannot continue to have a situation where women's voices don't matter, women's voices don't count. As large as Nigeria is, as prosperous as Nigeria is, as well educated as citizens of Nigeria are, both male and female, we have less than 5% of women in the National Assembly.
So disgraceful.
That's a disgrace. And then we keep pointing to countries like Rwanda, who have over 64% of women in their parliament. So access to women's access to leadership and decision making is another priority for Nigerian women. So all these issues are articulated, form part of the consensus that is important to drive movements forward. So there'll be elements in the movement who want to focus on one thematic area or the other. There are some who want to do a combination, of these issues. But the idea is we need to work as a movement to ensure that there is an enabling legal and policy framework, and that we have tools in place, and that there's accountability to help us address all these issues. Before you move on to another question, just to throw out some other enabling factors, it's important for us to address the issue of access to resources, because many times women's rights organizations want to do certain things and they can't get them done because they don't have resources. And so we need to keep appealing to development partners and to our government to do what they can to support the work of women's rights organizations. Women are the ones who know the issues that are of concern to them. Women are the ones who know how to make the strategies work, especially at community level. So we would need to see more resources out there to, address all these issues I've mentioned. And then, of course, there's the issue of technology. In my time, when we started mobilizing for the Beijing conference, that's when some of us, myself as an example, I used email for the first time in 1995 when we were preparing for the Beijing conference. And it wasn't just me, it was a whole lot of us. We had never used email before, but we were forced to, because that was the only way we could register for the NGO forum in Beijing. So we were all forced to get email accounts and go online and register. And I was based in London. It wasn't as if it's because I was based in Nigeria and we didn't have access to these tools.
As COVID has done the same thing now to everyone. Forced everybody online.
Exactly. So those who didn't know how to work online before have been forced to do it. So we need to continue to maximize the use of technology, because we are not going to have access to the same tools for networking and information sharing that we used to have. Face-to-face meetings, there are very few African countries that have not visited. I've been to so many continents around, actually all continents around the world. Movements are now not going to be as easy as they used to be. They're going to be ever more reliant on technology. And technology is the way young women in particular are now mobilizing in ways that we did not, and have been extremely effective with it. Yes. So I think we need to start pulling all these lessons together to make our movement stronger, more focused, and more efficient. So, in summary, we need to have, the women who are willing to do it, committed feminist and women's rights activists. We need to have consensus on the key issues we want to work on. We need to have access to resources, and we need to use technology effectively. And in all this, we need to remember that it requires intergenerational energy.
Absolutely.
We can have retired professors, retired lawyers, retired engineers. There's no such thing as a retired feminist.
And all men and women should be feminists, as Chinamanda would say. Anyway, so
yes, men can be feminists too, absolutely.
So you've touched on several important points, Your Excellency. But I think, so gender mainstreaming, as you say, to address the whole issue of, allocation of resources, the importance of, disciplined focus in the women's movement, and also, this issue of, attaining consensus and consistency and stick-with-itness, this whole issue of patience, being patient enough for the long haul, and not being prepared to delay the gratification for the outcomes that we seek and staying the course. I mean, these are all very important points, but I'd like to, take us back to the conversation around, gender-based violence and the subject of violence against women, which I know you are extremely passionate about, and which I know you have been amplifying your voice on, and which I know you have made, help to ensure, a lot of progression. And in addition, in the book, The Sheroes of Beijing, you did say that some progress has been made in the critical areas of concern, and you referred specifically to the enactment of the legislation, the Violence Against Persons Prohibitions Act in Nigeria. But I just wanted to highlight this point, and I wanted us to talk around this, that though the act is yet to be domesticated in all the 36 states, of the Federation in Nigeria. But there's no doubt that it's having such far-reaching legislation, such as the VAP Act, in place is progress in itself, and we must acknowledge that and acknowledge that achievement, and thank all of you, the key actors who have enabled us to attain this. There are, however, issues with the enforcement, of the law in the states that have actually enacted the act. So I wanted to ask you, Your Excellency, what action you think needs to be taken to ensure, first of all, that all the states in Nigeria domesticate the VAP Act, and furthermore ensure that they enforce it to protect women and girls in Nigeria from violence.
Thank you very much. Well, on the issue of ensuring that states domesticate the VAP Act, I think that is why last year, those of us in the Nigerian Governors' Wives Forum set up a special working group known as Nigerian Governors' Wives Against Gender-Based Violence, which I chair. And so we wrote to the Nigerian Governors' Forum asking them to declare a state of emergency on gender-based violence, because we knew that it would be extremely important for the governors to take this back to their states and encourage their respective state house of assembly to pass the legislation where it hasn't been passed. Without the legal frameworks, it's very difficult to push for these issues. So, and even when you have the legal frameworks, then you have to go, into the whole process of implementation. As of the time that the governors declared the state of emergency, and then the Federal Minister of Women's Affairs, Dame Pauline Tallen, also took the same request to the governors and to the Federal Executive Council. And there was a lot of goodwill around the need for the government at federal level and state level to do something. And so from the 10th of June 2020, when the governors declared the state of emergency, there were 13 states who had domesticated the VAP Act at that time, as of June 2020. Between then and now, we now have 21 states in the country who have domesticated the VAP Act. It's nowhere near enough, because we need all 36 states in the country to do so. But it's a good sign, and we are going to continue to appeal to the states, appeal to the legislators, and appeal to the community of rights activists in different states to keep up the pressure. Now, for those who have domesticated the law, now comes the hard work of implementation. Now, I have learned a number of things from our experience in Ekiti State. In 2011, we passed the gender-based violence law here in Ekiti State. And when we passed the law in 2011, we set up the monitoring mechanism known as the GBV Management Committee. And as soon as it was set up, we started work to implement the law, engage stakeholders, and so on. And by the time the administration came to an end in 2014, we had done considerable work. Unfortunately, between 2014 and 2018, nothing was done by the administration that came after us. The GBV Management Committee did not meet even once.
Oh, dear.
So when my husband went back as governor for a second term, starting from October 2018, it was as if we were starting from ground zero.
Yeah, so we lost ground.
So one of the first things we did, So one of the first things we did was review. We had to revise the law because the VAP Act had been passed in 2015. So we looked at the law that we had passed in 2011, and we looked at the provisions of the VAP Act, and we realized that there were aspects where the VAP Act was, of course, stronger, and there were aspects where our own law in the state was stronger than the VAP Act. So what we did was we revised our GBV law. Okay. And it was reenacted in October 2019. Oh. So we now have a stronger GBV law in Ekiti State.
Fantastic.
Yes, and so when we passed the law, we then started, and that continues up to now, the advocacy around the law not being a Fayemi law. The law not being a law for Erelu Bisi Adeleye-Fayemi. The law is a law for Ekiti people. And they need to take ownership of that law regardless of who is in power. So there are a number of things that are important if we want to effectively implement legislation around gender-based violence. The first is the existence of legal frameworks and policy frameworks to support the legal frameworks. So we have policy frameworks such as the name and shame policy. Anyone who is convicted of a sexual offense in Ekiti State will enter into our sex offenders register.
Good.
The name will also be sent to the sex offenders register that is hosted by NAPTIP at the federal level. We will also post photographs of the person in their community and inform their community leaders that this person has been convicted of a sex offense. Exactly. And then we also have a victims charter, which outlines the rights of all victims of violent crime in the state, including victims of gender-based violence. So the first place to start is legal and policy frameworks. The second is having a coordinating mechanism, an effective coordinating mechanism, because this is the body that will be responsible for implementing the law.
That's the administrative
that kind of coordinating mechanism needs to, well, it's not just administrative, it's both administrative and implementing as well, because it is interministerial, made up of different MGAs.
Okay.
So, for example, the Ekiti GBV Management Committee, which I chair, we have the Ministry of Women Affairs, Ministry of Justice, the Chief Judge, the police, Minister of Education, Information, local government are all represented, as well as civil society organizations. Okay. And we all have different roles that we play to ensure that different aspects of the law are implemented. The third thing to take.
Is that? Can you describe that as your M&E arm? Is that would that be a right descriptor?
Well, a coordinating mechanism is supposed to coordinate different interventions to ensure that the law is implemented effectively. So, for example, an implementing mechanism takes place of access to justice issues. How does a victim of GBV become a survivor? You only become a survivor if you are able to have access to justice, if you are able to get access to the support that you need from law enforcement and the legal system
to prosecute the case.
Exactly. So the coordinating mechanism also takes care of the third issue I wanted to raise, which was the issue of treatment, care, and protection. We keep talking about a culture of silence, that exists when people experience different forms of gender-based violence. The culture of silence exists because, victims of violent sexual, crimes or GBV crimes know that they might be blamed if something happens to them, or they'll be shamed. And this blaming and this shaming is always heaped on the shoulders of the victim and not of the perpetrator. Now, if you put a system in place to encourage people to come forward, they will come forward with their stories. And that needs to include access to treatment. They need to receive immediate medical support. They need to receive access to psychosocial support. They need legal support. And they need to know that you are going to be there for them. So we have to put in place a system for people to now move from being victims to becoming survivors.
Yes.
And an effective implementing mechanism ensures that.
And also to ensure that all the stigmatization that goes with
and
it
then
is
another
also eliminated.
area, exactly. Another important area is education and orientation for prevention. We cannot continue, to catch victims of sexual crimes without ensuring that people understand what it means to commit these crimes, how to prevent them where possible, and to encourage a culture that respects women and girls and their bodies.
Yes.
So we also have a whole lot of work to do around education and orientation.
Then
there is
there's
piece
one more
about community.
We're going to have to take a break in a few
Yes,
minutes.
there's one more.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, there's one more, and this is extremely important. Community engagement. A lot of times GBV cases falter because communities sabotage our cases. And so we need to get communities to take ownership of this issue, for them to know that when we are trying to seek justice for a survivor of gender-based violence, they are supposed to support what we are doing and not hinder the work we are doing. And so we engage with traditional rulers, with religious leaders, with the market associations, with community associations, and so on, so that we can all be part of the process together.
Fantastic.
And last but not least, before you go for your break, in all the things I have specified, there has to be strong political will. Because it is political will that will unlock the human, technical, and financial resources that are required to achieve success in all these areas.
Oh, thank you so much, Your Excellency, for these fantastic and great insights that you have shared so far, which really showcase the extent of the work that, has been taking place. And the fact that, we are making strides, we're not yet where we want to be, but significant progress has actually been made, and we must take time out to celebrate, the achievements. We'll be pausing now for a very quick break to listen to one of the critical areas of concern from the Beijing Platform for Action, and we'll be right back. So please stay with us.
The 1995 Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action flagged 12 key areas where urgent action was needed to ensure greater equality and opportunities for women and men, girls and boys. It also laid out concrete ways for countries to bring about change. UN Women works with governments and partners to ensure such change is real for women and girls around the world. Critical area of concern number 2, education and training of women. Education is essential for women to reach gender equality and become leaders of change. While women and girls today are far more educated than ever before, gaps remain. Educated women benefit entire societies, contributing to flourishing economies and the improved health, nutrition, and education of their families. Education and training are also tools to help change harmful gender stereotypes. UN Women promotes women's right to quality formal education in all fields. UN Women supports educational programs to promote gender equality and women's rights, revise formal school curricula and policies, and help train teachers, students, and parents.
Welcome back, madam. So let's dive back in. I'm speaking with Erelu Bisi Adeleye-Fayemi, Her Excellency. Madam, with your rich background in history and journalism, you are indeed a prolific writer and author. In fact, I have one of your books by my bedside, which I'm reading right now. I think the one you call Rapper. I'm reading that right now. You have written so many interesting books, and your passion for the causes you write about shines through in your body of work. Why do you think it is important to document our stories? and in particular the stories of African women and their significant contribution to nation building. What more do you think needs to be done to ensure that these rich and insightful stories are duly documented and not lost or forgotten forever?
Thank you very much, Auntie Amina. You've just, mentioned something that set me on this path many years ago when I was doing my master's in history at the University of Ife, now Obafemi Awolowo University. I went to one of my professors and I told him that I wanted to write my MA thesis on the history of Yoruba women in pre-colonial times. And he said to me, without even thinking it through, very flippantly, "Oh, you won't find any data for that."
Wow.
I did not know much then. I did not know whether I would find data or not. But something told me that what he was telling me was not right. Because if you are telling me that I will not find data on what Yoruba women did in their communities, it meant that they did not contribute anything. And we all know the role Yoruba women played without even going into the history books, in the economy, in politics, in culture, in religion, and so on. And that's what started me on this path, proving that women have always made significant contribution. And so when some of us started talking about women's rights, feminist issues, and so on, we kept being met with this familiar accusation that we are importing ideas from Western feminists and that African women have always been happy with their lot and we are trying to corrupt people in our society and overturn our valued cultures and tradition. I believe in a culture and tradition that values the contribution and the personhood of women. Women have always played great roles in our society. So we need to document this. And even if we can't tell the stories of those who have gone because we don't have access to their records, there are many women in our midst, including yourself. I'm challenging you, Auntie Amina, who can write their story, who can share their leadership lessons with others, who can share their challenges, their mistakes, what they did well, what they didn't do too well, so that others can learn from them. If you don't tell your story, if you don't write it, if you don't talk about it, it's as if it never happened.
Yes.
And guess what? History will remember those who were the loudest, those who wrote the most, and those who took up the most space. And that is why a lot of African history has been lost or has been silenced, because in other parts of the world, it was felt that that's where, the whole world existed and not in Africa. So we should not continue to make that mistake. We need to write, we need to tell stories, and we need to encourage young people to take an interest in the stories of the older ones around them.
Thank you so much for that. You've challenged me amongst many others, and I think I'm going to have to take up that challenge now. You shared a very interesting story of one of your memories from the Beijing conference, which I found really interesting. And I refer to the exchange, if you recall, that you said you had with the Chinese concierge at a hotel that you were staying at. And something around, a lost in transition moment of sorts, as you described it, in the book, which you fondly coined, and I quote, "Wait a minute," which I'm told means in Mandarin, wait a minute, right? And so you called it the wait a minute moments.
Yes.
Yes, you allude to the fact that this somehow reflects the progress made by, African women since Beijing, as it has been, a case of, very sadly, taking 10 steps forward and 5 steps back. So my question to you, Your Excellency, is why do you think this is the case? And how can you briefly share some parting thoughts to encourage the listeners on this podcast and readers of the book as we continue the advocacy and the fight for a more equal, more equitable, more inclusive, and more prosperous world?
Thank you very much. In the years after Beijing, every 5 years, the United Nations would organize a review of the Beijing Platform for Action, and different UN regions will get the mandate from New York to coordinate these reviews. And so I was part of the review of Beijing Plus Pi in the year 2000, and then, Beijing Plus 10, 2010 and on and on. By the time we got to the Beijing Plus 15 review, I was having a conversation with some colleagues, and amongst ourselves, we said, you know what, maybe we probably don't even need to attend this review. Because the reviews would either take place in Addis at the AU headquarters, or I think there was one where we went to Tunis or so. So we said, but then there was one, I think the last one I went to was hosted by the Gambia in 2010. So we said, we probably don't need to go to any of these reviews. We can sit at home and write the review because we know what the findings are going to be. There will be the same challenges from all our countries across the continent. Inability to implement the Beijing platform of action due to lack of resources, due to political unrest, due to weak gender machinery. The list go on and on. And the case is no different today. So I believe that we need to continue to put pressure on our government at national and state level to honor the commitments they have made to women. We have all these legal and policy frameworks in place. Let us start from there. And the ones we don't have in place, we need to enact them. So, for example, Nigeria ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, the 1979 CEDAW. Nigeria ratified CEDAW, I think, immediately after the UN passed it. But we have not domesticated CEDAW. And that is the reason why we need to get the Gender and Equal Opportunities Bill passed. If we can get that passed, then that will provide a whole range of rights and opportunities for Nigerian women. The policies that we do have, like the National Gender Policy, for example, which meant to be a roadmap for both the federal and state governments to follow to ensure that women's concerns, gender mainstreaming issues and concerns are addressed in state development plans, in women and the economy, women's access to health and reproductive rights, decision-making, and so on. To the best of my knowledge, only 3 states in Nigeria have domesticated the national gender policy, and Ekiti State was the first one to do so in October 2011. So we need to put pressure on our government to, give us an enabling legal and policy framework. Then the national and state gender machineries need to be well resourced. We cannot continue to make machineries for gender. It's not just the case of Nigeria. I've worked with gender machineries across the continent, and I know how insignificant the budgets and the human resources that are allocated to those, machineries are. But since we are talking about Nigeria, we need to do better when it comes to allocating resources to the national and gender state machineries. The budget of many of these ministries of women affairs and social development sometimes is one line item in the Ministry of, say, Education, Health, and Defense. And I'm not begrudging the budgets of those places. But are we saying that women are not important? Are we saying investing in the well-being of women and children is not important? So we need to do more around that. And then, of course, as I said earlier, we need strong women's movements to be able to engage in accountability, to be able to fill in gaps, and so on. Civil society organizations are not meant to take over the responsibilities of the state. But we are also aware that there are many gaps in terms of delivering, goods and services to people. And so the government and the private sector and donor partners should be encouraged to support civil society organizations, especially women's rights organizations, to fill in these gaps. Then in terms of where it connects with us as women's organizations, I think, as I said earlier, we need to be more tenacious. We need to be, I think patient. Yes, we can be patient. But people like me, because I've seen this play out for so long, I have earned the right to be impatient. But I also know that you cannot, replace a sense of urgency with a sense of just knocking your head against the wall and not achieving anything. I believe in achieving results. And so that is why I believe that we need to be strategic. We need to deploy people who occupy different spaces. We have women who are in government at federal level and state level. We have women in the private sector. We have women in the academia. We have women in trade unions. We have women in so many different spaces. So we need to come to the understanding that all these spaces and all this agency is important. No one is more important than the other. What we need to do is ensure that we use whatever space we occupy to make a difference.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, we need to look after one another. We need to care for ourselves. If you see what has happened with COVID-19, so many of us are dropping by the wayside, young and old. So we need to look after one another because, once we are gone, we are gone. But while we are here, we need to stay focused on the job and know that change will happen. It might not be immediate, but it will come. There are so many things that have changed over the past 26 years since Beijing. But I hope to see more in my lifetime.
Your Excellency, I could spend, I think, I'm sure even those listening to us this today, we could all spend, the whole day just listening to you and the wealth of knowledge and experience that you have on this subject matter. Thank you so much, for your insights and for what you have shared. Our prayer really is that, everybody awakens to the realization that,
thank you,
that we cannot develop as a country unless we include women and unless we mainstream the gender issues and we allocate the necessary resources and ensure that the voice of women is truly heard. A lot of the things that you've touched on this afternoon have showcased the importance of having women in leadership and in decision making. If we had a critical mass of women across the verticals that you have mentioned, I think things would move much, much faster and things would begin to change. Thank you so much, Madam. We unfortunately have to close this conversation at this point. I just want to seize this opportunity to thank you very much again for everything that you do to empower women, everything you have done and are still doing and will continue to do in the gender space. I give you my vote. I would vote Erelu Bisi Adeleye-Fayemi for president any day. I think that you do a great you do a great job.
No, I will not be doing that.
You will do a great job of it. We need women like you in leadership, in key positions. I know you're doing a great job, in your current role and also supporting, your very able partner who also is doing a fantastic job. But honestly, we need to see more people like you right at the helm of affairs. Thank you so much, Madam, for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I've enjoyed spending time with you. And thank you for all that you do as well.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Have a good afternoon.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sheroes of Beijing podcast series. For more insights, follow us up across our social media handles. Follow UN Women on Twitter at UN Women Nigeria. Follow WISCAR on Instagram at WISCARNG and WISCAR Nigeria on Facebook and LinkedIn, or at Africa Business Radio.